Thank you, Jason. A couple of quick announcements before we turn it over to Megan for some commentary on our papers today. You should all know that the Midwestern History Association will meet this spring in May in Oxford, Ohio at Miami University. So please join us for that conference if you are able. Also, we are always looking for interesting submissions at the Journal Middle West Review. If you have some ideas, catch me after the panel. Lastly, I did want to also note that at the same time that this book came out on the 10-year anniversary of the founding of the Midwestern History Association and Middle West Review, Oxford University Press released their Oxford Handbook of Midwestern History, which I saw downstairs at the Oxford University Press table. And sometimes they give those away at the end of the conference. So if you run down there when they're closing up, they might give it to you. They don't want to lug it back to New York, probably. All right, our final speaker this morning, before we open it up to questions from you, is Megan Birk, who is a professor of history and the Bernadette Schmidt Chair of Excellence at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Her first two books, published with the University of Illinois Press, explore the dynamics of localized social welfare through policies, institutions, and the role of the central state. She is working on a book about motherhood, home economics education, and the use of children on campuses for educational purposes. She is currently the president of the Midwestern History Association. So please give a hand to Megan.
I'm going to just go ahead and slide this over so that I can stay in my spot. Good morning, everyone. As John has mentioned, this panel was conceived as a way to help draw attention to the new edited volume, and it brought together an array of scholars, many of whom are leaders in their field, to introduce to a wider audience the type of work that's being done on the Midwest. The authors featured here this morning and in other edited volumes on the region showcase the importance of case studies, local stories, and larger themes that unite the region. And more broadly, since we're in Chicago for the AHA, I wanted to acknowledge that we're in the capital of the Midwest. The second city plays foil to its coastal siblings, but for the region under consideration here this morning, it's the economic brains and I think in some ways the symbolic heart of the region. In this, Midwestern historians are fortunate. Few other regions can point to a place and say, that is the place where you will see our significance on display. A deeply indigenous place where agriculture meets industry, diversity meets homogeneity, and history informs the speculative future. How do we decide when a field of scholarship has matured? If we personified the Midwestern History Association as an example of the field of Midwestern history, it would be a preteen with growing pains but a clear identity. If it's the phrase itself, the Middle West, it's a centenarian. But if the scholarship itself is the thing, I would argue the field is closer to an AARP membership than a driver's license. A slew of geography and environment, agriculture and urbanization work in the late 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s when John C. Hudson, Drew Caton, Thomas Sugru, Bill Cronin, John Jurdy, Doug Hurt, and others, including a surge of rural women's history that was led by people like Mary Neff and Dorothy Schweiter, set out to describe and define not only boundaries, but perceptions and lived experiences. In 1998, Drew Caton and Susan Gray held an event at Miami University in Ohio to discuss what to do with a region that, in their words, lacked the kind of geographic coherence, historical issues, and cultural touchstones that informed regional identity. Later this year, as John mentioned, the MHA is going back to Miami to demonstrate how far scholarship can go even without the coherence that marks our regional peers. James Shortridge once referred to the Midwest as a region without a historical core. Nicole Etchison said there was no historic burden for the region to carry, no singular connection, no Puritan founding, no secession, no Spanish Catholic mission system. I think there is ample evidence at this point to suggest the field has overcome this dilemma. If it isn't exceptional, then is it typical? That was a question many academics, including myself, had to wrestle with when they were working on the region. This question is no longer exclusively driving the scholarship of the region, which I find encouraging. New directions, new methodologies, and new framings have stopped having to only answer why the Midwest. With only a grid system and a potentially vague sense of self to bind it, today scholars are making use of Midwestern history as a study of relationships between people, the landscape, new points of cultural contact, the rest of the country, and the world. These relationships create change on the land and cultural change. They imprint on the fabric of the people and places. Historians construct their understandings of the region's significance using a shared sense of place as it's understood by people and as it exists geographically. What brings together the concept of a region are the connections, the links scholars make, both internal and external. Perceptions are important, both in how a place sees itself and how others see it. As Caton asserted, it isn't necessary for conformity to exist on these views. Constant contestation of such concepts is healthy and dynamic. Heterogeneity is harder to succinctly define, but it's much more interesting to study. Scholarship being done on the region today demonstrates the opportunities for interdisciplinary work that embraces the overlap of history with sociology, political science, music, art, and literature, alongside things like Indigenous studies, Latinx studies, African American studies, and so many others. Earlier this weekend, there was a dynamic panel on LGBTQ history that showed just how much more there is to know about not just the history of those often marginalized people, but the importance of the rural and urban connections of the Midwest. Some of the chapters in this new edited volume make these connections explicit. Chicago civil rights activists, the importance of the Latinx story for the region's 20th century, shifting agricultural interventions, among many others. They demonstrate that place matters and shapes the historic responses of individuals and groups. Broad historiographies and case studies are both helping to deepen our knowledge. The field of Midwestern history is ready for adulthood. The scholarship being produced each year by new and established historians alike has provided the necessary platform to support thriving graduate student work that takes the region seriously as a character in their studies, and academics and public historians from across the country are building from one another's historiographical foundations to develop what I think are exciting new arguments from which to build. This space to contextualize relationships and the role of the region, or even micro-regions inside the Midwest, now exists without having to defend the legitimacy of the setting. Innovative work on the Black experience, religion, activism, labor organizing, national security, foodways, extractive industry, I had a huge list, I'll stop there. It's thriving. Established scholars in the field are producing award-winning monographs. And despite a grim outlook at many university presses, the University of Illinois Press recently launched a new regional imprint. Kristen Hoganson, who was mentioned here this morning, recently became a Guggenheim Fellow. There remains a robust public history community in the region. It's a long-standing tradition in the Midwest that is continuing despite a really challenging environment. While some of this work places regionalization as a focal point, for others it's a setting, a place where connections of historical importance took place. The region can be both a setting and a framework. The Midwest is working as a canvas where struggles and successes are analyzed, compared, and contextualized. The MHA supports an article prize, a book prize, a dissertation award, and a research award, two of which are new and endowed so that we can ensure the longevity that's enjoyed by our peer organizations like the Western and the Southern. Drew Caton noted once that the widespread Midwestern obsession with public civility should be taken seriously as a historic construction. He surmised that Midwest nice came from, in his words, efforts to negotiate life in an immensely complicated, highly fluid world with a bewildering array of customs, borders, and expectations. Regional identity need not be keenly felt by all the residents to make for fascinating historical study. And as scholars continue to produce work about the complicated and fluid region, its residents, environment, economy, cultures, and politics, new relationships and significance will continue to emerge. What historian would fail to embrace the challenge of studying a bewildering array? Not just a heartland, a crossroads, a flyover, or a breadbasket, but as a significant historical designation and destination. Thanks.
Okay, let's hear from you in the audience. Who has a question for our panelists?
Not everyone at once, I know it's okay.
Well, yes, sir, go ahead.
I want to ask you, Jason, I regret that we didn't get the PowerPoint.
I'm sorry for that. I should have anticipated it. That's my
As
mistake.
a recovering art historian, I feel your pain. I wonder though, one of the problems that I've encountered in my toe in the water of Midwestern history is kind of hamster wheel arguments about defining the boundaries, what is, what isn't. And when you're thinking about this really interesting conversation between land and human beings, do you see that it continues west? I'm thinking about Georgia O'Keeffe in the South. I'm thinking about certain photographers, Richard Serra. Is there a boundary here that you would draw around the thesis that you're a geographic boundary that you're putting forward?
Right. I think it's a great question, and I would say no and yes. There's not a boundary in the strictest of senses as to imagine that some sort of absolutely unique set of relationships or set of affinities emerges in the Midwest that happens nowhere else. Because of course, I mean, you've given at least 2 or 3 examples just right here that would immediately shoot that down. To think about, as art historians and historians often have done, in Georgia O'Keeffe, the way in which there's some perceived in-depth psychological, even physical affinity between her, not only her mind, but even her sort of physical body, and the New Mexico landscapes that she becomes best known for inhabiting. Serra is the same, and in fact, you could think of Richard Serra with his with his massive steel sculptures, which begin, art historians have argued, to take on a sense of the spatiality, the vast spatiality of the West. Right. And there's been an argument that it takes him being in Los Angeles working at the now defunct Kaiser Steel plant, and sort of in doing so reflecting on really the sort of vast desert plains of Nevada to sort of conceive of work in the sort of monumental form that he does. So no.
Okay.
On the other hand, yes, which is to say that I think one of the, as a sort of student of American regionalism, I would say that one of the sort of connecting tissues of all sort of regionalist discourses, including cosmopolitan discourses. New York, for example, is about as regionalist in its outlook and identity as one gets. Often have this call upon this sort of visceral, seemingly visceral component or relationship between the sort of not just the kind of abstract spaces in the sense of sort of what you might call social or political areas that one inhabits, but between the real kind of material stuff of the place, the grittiness of the streets of New York, producing Dos Passos, for example. And so I think the Midwest has that. Midwest has a number it has a unique topography relative to other topographies. It has a unique history of the sort of encounter and inhabitation of that topography. And so in that sense, it seems to me that both answers are appropriate.
Real quickly on the question of boundaries, I know some people get tired of talking about this in the field, but this is one of the first questions that often comes up when you interact with people outside of the field is, well, what do you mean by Midwest? And over the last decade, there have been 3 books that have come out about 3 of the boundaries of the Midwest. There's a book that came out in 2018 called The Interior Borderlands, about where the Midwest ends and the Great Plains begin. And there's a book that came out called North Country, again from University of Oklahoma Press, who did this book, about what are the northern boundaries of the Midwest. And Kent State University Press did a book, I think it was this year, this year, or no, 2025, called Beyond East and Midwest, or Between East and Midwest, but anyway, about the eastern boundary of the region, which, to give away the plot, is essentially eastern Ohio. But we still need to do a book on, which will, I think, be the easiest book, because there's so much written about this, where the Midwest ends and where the South begins. That will be a fun project that discussions have started on that front. So this is one of the animating questions for the field. People like to talk about, a lot of people like to talk about it. We did a poll, we commissioned a poll in the journal Midwest Review, and we polled like 20 states and asked people, are you in the Midwest? And you know, in places like Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, 97% of people, which is an incredible number, 97% said, yes, we live in the Midwest, we are in a Midwestern state. And then you get these interesting boundary issues. These people in eastern Montana who said they lived in the Midwest, that triggered the Wall Street Journal to do a story, a front page story about, well, what are the boundaries and why do these people in the eastern part of Montana think they're Midwesterners? And it was basically because they're living in small towns with a lot of rural agricultural operations and wheat farming, so it kind of felt Midwestern. But you know, at some point in Montana, you obviously turn Western. So that's some deep thoughts on boundaries. Anybody else have a question for our group? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about another existential question, I think, beyond not only what is the Midwest, but also how to deal with a lack of regional identity, given its fluidity as being in the middle of America or the United States. And obviously we heard that there can also be this transnational influence as well, right? There's not just this national middle, but even a transnational influence coming in as well from an international influence from other parts of the globe. So I'm wondering, as a field, and this may be more of a state of the field question, and anybody can take it up if you want, but how do we deal with, as historians or scholars of the Midwest, creating or finding a Midwest identity within this ambiguous geographic space, but also considering its fluidity maybe as part of its identity, or is that kind of a separate issue?
Jason, looked like you want to answer this.
Oh, I did?
Oh.
Well, you know,
We're kind of shifting around in your seat. So.
What immediately came to mind, but I don't know if this answers your question or raises more, is that I think historically the Midwest, unlike other regions, became for a time, a universal American identity in popular terms very quickly in its state of maturation. So roughly around 1890 or so, and reaching a kind of high tide, I would place it at the founding of Main Street USA and Disneyland is a convenient place. Roughly, 3 generations or so, starting with syndicated authors like William Allen White in the early 20th century, who's exporting Emporia as kind of a fantasy apotheosis of the American project to the kind of shtick of Main Street USA. And so the fluidity for me as a cultural historian is less a product of facts on the ground and more a product that there was no real incubation period of regionality, like the South had in the aftermath of the Civil War. Like perhaps the West had in its characterization after the Second World War as a kind of out there in the past where, you know, men were men, etc., right? And so that kind of universalization that happened very quickly led to a kind of dissipation of regional identity in its universalization, and then reactions to it as a kind of reaction to Americanness overall, of which I tried to argue the revolt from the village was sort of a beginning inception, coming out of modernism in the 1920s as a sort of foil. I mean, you know, very early Sinclair Lewis is making the claim in the beginning of Main Street that you can find Main Street anywhere. And he finds it, in the south and in the west. But he happens to place it in Gopher Prairie, Minnesota. And so I don't know if that speaks to your question, but I think that speaks to some of its fluidity, at least in the popular mind.
I don't have a succinct answer to your question. I suspect that, probably not expected. But one of the things that I often think about and go back to a lot is the long history of the region as a sort of intricate web of international connections, as a migrant as a magnet for immigrants, and then a sort of agricultural product that's being sent out all across the world very early. And when we think about all the industry in the Midwest, whether we want to do Rust Belt or we want to do, today's version of, we could do the insurance industry in Des Moines. There's a long history, multi-century history of the Midwest as having been a place of interactions, significant economic and cultural interactions with the rest of the world. And your question reminded me of, I think Christy Napan Warren was at your session a few months ago. Christy's work from the University of Iowa, she's a sociologist doing religious studies in the contemporary Midwest. But her work is very, I think, symbolic of the contemporary role of the Midwest as continually evolving into new communities and new shapes that are international in nature, whether it's meatpacking or other places. And so I think one of the nice parts about studying the Midwest is that sometimes those very small kind of unique histories end up answering bigger questions for us or help kind of point us in a direction of how we think about the region and that changing identity over time, but those sort of fingers that have stretched out and that kind of international web that's been long important and not just a 20 or 21st century phenomenon.
So I would say quickly, just in reference to that, your question overlaps with something I was thinking of during Jason's presentation, which was this question of this weird kind of almost existential desire of Midwesterners to get to other places, versus what becomes then their sort of often trenchant desire to recreate the Midwest in those other places where they happen to arrive. Disney perhaps is the great example of this, who essentially the founding of Disneyland in the orange groves of Southern California is about rebuilding Main Street, and I think primarily, at least to my view, sort of Mark Twain's America in Southern California. I've been doing some projects on trees in Southern California recently, and Los Angeles, the streets are lined with Midwestern trees that are brought by immigrants from the Midwest who are supposedly fleeing the Midwest in order to sort of live in sunny Southern California, who then begin to recreate the Midwest in those places. So, strangely enough, in terms of thinking about boundaries, I find as a Midwesterner now working in Southern California, that finding it's those instances where you find the Midwest in places that are not the Midwest that are very telling, I think, about the sort of meaning and the power of the region. Number one, why plant a Midwestern oak tree, on the streets of Los Angeles? But also because that would seem to say something about what it is, what are the sort of values that people cling to or sort of bring in tow as they move to other places, and their values that are wrapped up primarily in anxieties. But part of the anxiety is in being from somewhere is the anxiety of what you choose to maintain, even as you sort of flee that place.
If I can, John, I just wanted to say.
Why don't you use this?
Sure. I think very fruitful comments, and I was just thinking, part of this discourse I think has to be on external impressions, and you're getting it a little bit, Jason, the idea of the transplanted looking back and wanting to remember it as well. And a lot of my research right now has been really focusing on the 1970s. And as someone who was born in 1961 in Southern Illinois, and grew up during that period of time, the 1970s was an absolute horrific time in America. I look back on it now as one of the most defining periods of where we're at. And I was just thinking of a couple different kinds of things, national in scope, but that deal with the Midwest. Number one is media. And for those of you who have studied television and the history of television, and keep in mind Chicago, talking about Chicago as the capital of the Midwest, Chicago was really a prime player in the development of American broadcasting in the 1950s and 60s. There was a period of time at the end of the 1960s and 1970s that was called, I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but it was kind of the night the country died. CBS had the top rated shows in the country, and they were all rural shows. Now, yes, some of them were Mayberry, North Carolina, but this sense of rural America, and which personifies the Midwest. And all of a sudden, executives in New York decide that, well, these are top 10 shows, but they're not bringing in the youth demographic, so we're doing away with it. At the same time as you move into the 1970s, think about those television shows that are dealing with really contemporary themes that are located in the urban Midwest. You know, there was a show, I'm trying to remember, I think it was One Day at a Time, that dealt with a single mother who moves to Indianapolis. The Mary Tyler Moore Show, right? Struggling with this idea of, well, is Mary Tyler Moore going to be divorced or not, or runaway bride that begins a career in Minneapolis. Bob Newhart here in Chicago as a psychologist. All of a sudden, and Good Times. Laverne and Shirley in Milwaukee, and Good Times that dealt with issues that were racially derived in the idea of Chicago. So these kinds of things. The other thing was political. I got to experience firsthand because my father was finishing his doctorate down at SIU in Carbondale, not SIU-E, but SIUC. And I always tell my students this. My birthday was 4 days after Kent State in May of 1970. And downtown Carbondale, and most of you I guess don't know Carbondale. Carbondale was probably 15, 16, 18,000. SIU was a really kind of a leading second-tier university at that period of time in terms of research and national reputation. But it was destroyed by rioters downtown, and we were under occupation of the National Guard. And so once again, this perception of others, oh my God, if Carbondale, Illinois can be under martial law in 1968, what's wrong with the country? And once again, it gets that sense of, oh, the Midwest is normative. Well, no, the Midwest is part of this larger national and international experience that's going on. So I think as we also look at perceptions of Midwesterners, what our identity is too, we also, and all of us have talked about this kind of ongoing dialectic between the outside and the Midwest itself.
I was just gonna say one thing about what we might call Midwest imperialism, for lack of a better word, because at the end of the 19th century, the Midwest was the biggest region. I mean, places like the Southwest, California, they were tiny. Iowa had 3 times the population of California in 1900. So this was the biggest region, but there was movement out of it as farms became bigger, there was less need for a farm every section. So what I'm getting at is, where did these people go? There's a really interesting story to be told here. All these Midwesterners who went to Southern California, planted all those trees, and they would have big Iowa parties, and they would celebrate where they came from. And Ronald Reagan from Illinois, he did very well in those precincts in LA when he was running for governor of California. Rick Perlstein, who's a Chicagoan, wrote these books, Reagan Land, Nixon Land, etc. In the one on Barry Goldwater, he talks about how Arizona was a tiny state, you know, a couple 100,000 people, whatever it was, at the turn of the century, in 1900. And they were all Democrats because they had come from the South, which was a one-party region. But all of a sudden, all these Midwesterners start moving into Arizona in the 40s and 50s after the war, into the Sun Belt. And most of the Midwesterners were Republicans because that's where the Republican Party was founded in the Midwest, and all those people moved to Arizona. They changed the politics of the state so a person like Barry Goldwater could get elected. We're gonna publish an article in the upcoming issue of Midwest Review about the Midwestern influence on Florida and these enclaves of Midwesterners there and how they shaped various towns in Florida. And it's written by a geographer at University of Florida. It's super interesting. So, yes, this is part of this more recent history of the Midwest. Where did these people go to and what influence did they have? Did you have comments? You wanna add something?
No, we're probably gonna release people into the wild very shortly.
All right, one last comment or question for the good of the order? Okay, we'll wrap up because Megan's right, we're 1 minute away from being over time. So thanks everybody for coming.